January 15, 1945, Fort Davis, West Texas, 9:47 p.m. Sergeant James Caldwell kicked open the door of Barracks 7 so hard the hinges screamed. 200 German women spun around. His face was stone. No anger, no mercy, no expression at all. He spoke 5 words in German words he had spent 3 days memorizing. Sleep without your clothes tonight. Then he was gone. The door slammed shut behind him like a coffin lid. Outside, American soldiers in gas masks were unloading metal drums from trucks. Rubber hoses thick as a man's arm. Pressure tanks with gauges spinning in the freezing air. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The women could see their own breath, and through the dirty windows they watched the masked soldiers seal every window with rubber strips, connect hoses to the walls, and wait. 73 women reached into their clothing and found small pills hidden in the seams. Cyanide. In Frankfurt, 8 days ago, a commanding officer had pressed one into each woman's palm during the evacuation. You know what Americans do to our women. His voice had been flat, matter of fact. This is your way out. Better to die with honor than live in shame. 2 women had already used theirs in the first week of captivity. Now, Margaret Hoffman, 25 years old, former radio operator, stood in the frozen barracks holding the pill in her fist and watching gas masks move through the darkness outside, and believed with complete certainty that the end had arrived. She was wrong. What happened next in Barracks 7 that January night would not be recorded in any major history book. No general would be decorated for it. No monument would be built. A 24-year-old private from Columbus, Ohio, whose sister had died of typhoid fever when she was 7 years old, would spend his entire month's wages and write 200 handwritten notes by flashlight during night shifts, and those notes would break 200 women more completely than any weapon ever could. Because cruelty confirms what you already believe. Kindness destroys everything. This is what actually happened at Fort Davis. And almost no one knows. 3 weeks before Caldwell kicked that door open, the camp medical unit had run routine blood tests on the female prisoners. The results came back on December 28, 1944, and Dr. William Harrison, 42 years old public health officer from Philadelphia, stared at those results for a long time before picking up the telephone. Bants, over 90% of the women were infested with body lice. Not a few, not an inconvenience. A catastrophic systemic infestation that had been building for months inside German military barracks, inside evacuation trucks, inside every space where exhausted women in unwashed uniforms had been pressed together without clean water or soap or time. The lice had bred in uniform seams, in blankets in the wood grain of the barracks floors, in hair and skin. Each woman was a walking colony. And each louse carried Rickettsia prowazekii, the bacteria that causes epidemic typhus. Harrison had seen the numbers before the war. Epidemic typhus killed between 10% and 40% of its victims depending on conditions. The incubation period was 14 days. By the time the first fever appeared, the bacteria would already have spread silently through the entire population. 200 infected women in close quarters. American guards rotating through daily. A supply chain connecting Fort Davis to 3 other camps, 2 military hospitals, and the civilian town of Marfa, 8 miles away. Baden. If he did nothing, he was not looking at a medical problem. He was looking at a plague. The math was brutal and simple. Harrison wrote it in a single line in his report to Colonel Robert Dixon. If we do not act within 7 days, we cannot stop this. Dixon read the report on December 29th and made 3 decisions inside of 90 seconds. First, the delousing operation would happen at night to minimize panic. Second, every woman's uniform would be collected, cleaned, and returned before dawn. Third, Harrison would explain nothing in advance. An explanation in German, delivered to 200 women who had been told Americans were savages, would not produce calm understanding. It would produce chaos. It would produce the exact panic that would get people killed. The plan had one devastating flaw that nobody caught until it was too late. Nobody told the women. Private Daniel Murphy had joined the Army Medical Corps in 1941. Before that, he was a farmer's son from a town so small it didn't appear on most Ohio maps. He had been 11 years old in 1932 when his sister Mary got sick. Typhoid fever. Rural Ohio in the Depression had doctors the way it had luxuries rarely and expensively. His parents couldn't afford one. Murphy had watched Mary die over 14 days. First the fever, then the headache that made her scream, then the rash spreading across her abdomen like a bruise blooming in slow motion. Then the delirium, the moments where she didn't know him, where she called him names he'd never heard. Then silence. He had joined the medical corps because of Mary. He had told himself on the day he signed the papers that he would never watch another person die from a preventable disease if he had the power to stop it. That was the entire reason. Not patriotism, not adventure. Mary. When the typhus blood results came back from the female camp, Murphy was the junior technician who processed the paperwork. He read the numbers, read them again, and sat very still for about 30 seconds. Then he went to find Dr. Harrison. He volunteered for the overnight delousing operation without being asked. But 3 days before the operation, Murphy did something that was not in any protocol, not in any order, not sanctioned by anyone above the rank of private. He went to the PX the camp store with his entire month's wages. $42. He bought every chocolate bar they had. British-made plain-wrapped nothing special. 2 ounces each. He bought 200 of them. Then he sat in the motor pool during his off hours over 2 nights under a work light writing notes by hand on scraps of paper torn from a supply manifest. 200 notes. He was not a writer. His handwriting was cramped and uneven. Some notes were only 3 words. You will survive. Stay strong. Mary would want me to help. He folded each note, tucked it inside a chocolate wrapper, and put it in a box under his bunk. Nobody knew. Nobody had approved it. Nobody would have stopped him if they had known, but nobody knew. The night of January 15th, the temperature outside fell to 28 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there. The delousing equipment required specific conditions. Temperature held at exactly 95 degrees Fahrenheit inside the treatment zone for exactly 7 hours to kill every adult louse, every egg, every larva hiding in fabric and wood. The machinery to achieve this in freezing outdoor temperatures required the American soldiers to work in full protective gear, monitoring gauges, maintaining pressure, checking seals, for the entire night. Murphy stood at the main pressure tank for 4 hours straight. His hands went numb through his gloves at hour 2. He kept checking the gauges. Inside barracks, 7 Margaret Hoffman was standing at the window, watching the gas masks and not breathing. She had been a radio operator. She understood equipment, understood systematic preparation, understood the difference between improvised cruelty and organized procedure. The machinery outside was organized, systematic, deliberate. This was not a mob. This was a protocol. In her experience, organized protocols were more dangerous than mobs because they could not be reasoned with. Anna Weber, 19 years old, grabbed the arm of Elizabeth Hoffman, 27 surgical nurse 3 years on the Eastern Front. Anna whispered the words that every woman in the room was thinking. Her voice was barely audible over the sound of wind and machinery outside. They will defile us. Elizabeth had seen things on the Eastern Front that had removed from her the capacity for simple fear. What she felt now was more complex. She looked at Anna's face, at the pill clutched in the girl's fist, at the 200 women standing in a frozen barracks, with their breath clouding the air, and she made a decision that had nothing to do with orders or ideology or patriotism. She took the pill out of Anna's hand and put it in her own pocket. Not yet, she said. Wait. At 11:30 p.m., Dr. Harrison entered Barracks 7, wearing a fresh uniform, no gas mask, carrying nothing threatening. Behind him came Helena Schmidt, a prisoner who spoke functional English, serving as interpreter. Harrison stood at the front of the room and waited for silence that came very quickly, because 200 women were desperately trying to understand what was happening to them. Then he explained. Mosse, 3 American soldiers had died from typhus in the main camp the previous day. Dozens more were critically ill. The blood tests had revealed the infestation. The machinery outside was steam and chemical equipment, not gas. The temperature being maintained was to kill the lice in the wood and fabric of the barracks itself. The women's uniforms had already been collected from a separate storage building, washed in 180-degree water, pressed and folded. He said, "An epidemic does not respect borders or uniforms. If you get sick, my soldiers get sick. If a plague starts here, it spreads everywhere. Saving you saves us. Simple mathematics." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than before. Before, it had been the silence of people waiting to die. Now, it was the silence of people trying to recalibrate an entire worldview in real time. Sophie Clean looked down at her own arms. The welts had been there for weeks. She had assumed they were a rash, assumed it was stress, assumed it was the cold. Now she looked at them and counted. Hundreds of bite marks. And as the heat from the delousing equipment began penetrating the barracks walls, she watched the lice fall. From the ceiling. From the walls. From the seams of her clothing, dropping in a slow black rain onto the floor that turned dark with tiny bodies. "We were infested," Sophie said later. Her voice, when she described this moment to historians decades afterward, was still hollow with a specific kind of shock. All that time. We were infested. Margaret Hoffman stood very still and felt something happening inside her that was worse than fear and harder to name. She had carried the propaganda for years, had watched the films, had been told, the stories had believed. Not blindly, not stupidly, but the way you believe things when everyone around you believes them, and the evidence seems to confirm them, and the alternative requires admitting that the entire structure of your understanding is false. Her commanding officer's voice. "You know what Americans do to our women." But the Americans had known about the lice for weeks, had tested, had planned, had built an operation specifically designed to save the lives of enemy prisoners, had stood outside in 28-degree cold for hours, monitoring pressure gauges to ensure the temperature stayed precisely right for precisely long enough to kill every organism that was slowly killing the women they were supposed to hate. At midnight, Private Murphy appeared at the barracks door. He was pale from hours in the freezing air, his hands still red and clumsy from the cold. He carried a tray of metal cups. Real coffee. Steam rising off each one. He said, "The worst is over. Now we rebuild your strength." Margaret took a cup. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear. From something she had no category for. Yet. Something that would take years to fully name. She was an intelligent woman, a trained professional, someone who prided herself on clear thinking. And she was being destroyed not by violence, not by cruelty, but by a cup of coffee held by a 24-year-old farm boy whose hands were red with cold from saving her life. Dawn on January 16th came at 6:47 a.m. On each woman's cot, folded with exact precision, was a clean uniform. Margaret touched the fabric before she put it on. The cotton was soft in a way that seemed impossible. No lice, no 6 months of embedded grime, no blood, no sweat, no evidence of everything the war had deposited in the fibers. Someone had washed these uniforms. Someone had spent hours in the night in the cold, scrubbing enemy clothing with soap and hot water, and a kind of care that required intention. Anna found a small tear in her sleeve that had been stitched closed. The stitching was not expert work. It was amateur, slightly uneven, earnest. Someone had noticed a torn seam on an enemy soldier's uniform and had stopped to repair it. Sophie Clean started crying when she put on clean underwear. It was such a small thing. It was an enormous thing. It was proof that someone had thought about her comfort, had considered her humanity, had decided she deserved the basic dignity of clean clothing, even though she was a prisoner, even though she was the enemy, even though nobody required it. Breakfast arrived at 7:15. The smell reached the barracks before the tray did. Bacon. Real bacon fat, rendering edges, crisping the sound and smell of a country that had not been broken by the war, that could feed its prisoners better than Germany had fed its soldiers. Eggs, butter, white bread, coffee from actual beans. Anna Fisher looked at her plate and said quietly, "This is more food than I have seen in one sitting in a year." But it was the pockets. When Margaret reached into the pocket of her clean uniform, her fingers found a small rectangle wrapped in paper. A chocolate bar, 2 ounces British made, and inside the wrapper, a note written in cramped, uneven English that she had to read 3 times before she understood it. "You will survive. Signed, DM." She looked around the room. Every woman was holding a note. Some were laughing a strange, high, disbelieving sound. Some were crying. Some were simply sitting on their cots, holding a piece of paper and a chocolate bar in both hands, staring at them the way you stare at something that has overturned a fundamental assumption about the world. "Mary would want me to help." Signed, DM. Private Daniel Murphy had spent his entire month's wages, had written 200 notes by hand, for enemy women. Because his sister had died from a preventable disease when she was 7 years old, and he had promised himself he would not let that happen again if he had the power to stop it. Helena bit into her chocolate, and the sweetness hit her like a detonation. She had forgotten that taste existed, not just the taste of chocolate, which she had not had in over a year. The taste of being considered, of being seen as a person who deserved a small kindness, of being against all logic and propaganda and the entire machinery of war worth someone's wages and handwriting and care. Margaret thought about her commanding officer's pill. She still had it. She reached into the pocket where she had kept it for 8 days and held it in her palm next to the chocolate wrapper with its 3 words. "You will survive." She looked at both things for a long time. Then she walked to the latrine, dropped the pill into the drain, and returned to finish her breakfast. Sergeant Caldwell appeared at 700 with his face still showing nothing. He said, "Full rations 1200 hours. Medical check at 1400. He said it the same way he had said everything, flat and efficient, like a man who understood that doing the right thing required no special announcement. He turned and walked out. In 3 days, the typhus threat would begin to recede. Blood tests would come back cleaner. The fevers gripping 3 of the women who had already moved into early-stage infection would break. The organism that had been growing in their blood, fed by the lice that had fed on them for months, would begin to die. 200 German women had been saved from a plague they had not known they were carrying by an enemy they had been taught to fear more than death itself. And somewhere in those 3 days, something shifted, not loudly, not with any announcement, but permanently. Margaret Hoffman looked at the medical insignia sewn onto her old German uniform. She had taken an oath before any of this started. An oath to heal the sick and injured. An oath that came before nations, before politics, before war. She had taken it in a ceremony that felt formal and distant, now something from another life, another girl. But the oath was still there, still hers. On the morning of January 19th, she stood at the window of Barracks 7 and watched stretchers carry wounded American soldiers into the medical tent. She watched the exhausted faces of 12 American nurses who had not slept properly in days. She watched the ratio 5 patients for every nurse, a number that meant someone was not getting the care they needed. A number that meant people might die from neglect. That was not anyone's fault, just the arithmetic of a war that created more wounds than anyone could heal. She was a trained medical professional. They needed medical professionals. The mathematics were simple. She put on her uniform. She walked across the frozen compound. She had no idea what would happen next. She had no plan beyond the oath and the mathematics and the memory of a chocolate wrapper with 3 handwritten words. She pushed open the flap of the medical tent. Colonel Dixon looked up from his clipboard. He looked at her German uniform. He looked at the medical insignia on her sleeve. He looked at his 12 exhausted nurses. He said one sentence in English, and Helena, who had followed Margaret across the compound without being asked, translated it into German. "Can you work on American soldiers?" Margaret did not hesitate for even 1 second. "Blood is blood," she said. "Pain is pain. I took an oath to heal." Brandon Dixon studied her face for a moment. Then he made a decision. He gave her a time to report in the morning. He told her they would start with simple cases. He told her she would have to prove herself before they trusted her with more. Then he did something that stopped Margaret's breath entirely. He returned her salute. 2 medical professionals, 1 oath, no flags. In 48 hours, every woman with any medical training in Barracks 7 would follow her through that tent flap. Elizabeth Hoffman, Anna Weber, Helena Schmidt, 47 women in total trading the status of prisoner for the impossible role of healer to the enemy. And in 1 week a convoy carrying 2,000 German officers would arrive at Fort Davis. Among them, a colonel named Friedrich Steinberg, who had memorized their faces, who kept lists, and who would stand in the doorway of the medical tent and say one word in a voice like a weapon: traitor. What happened next would divide those 47 women forever, and the choice each of them made would follow them for the next 20 years, across an ocean, into hospitals and courtrooms and deathbed rooms, into a question that none of them could answer until they had lived long enough to see the full shape of what they had started on a freezing January night in West Texas, with a cup of coffee and a handwritten note that said, "You will survive." 47 German women had crossed the compound and walked into the American medical tent. Margaret Hoffman had performed her first surgery on a 19-year-old soldier from Ohio. Elizabeth Hoffman was teaching trauma techniques that American surgeons had never seen. Anna Weber was holding wounded men's hands and writing letters home for soldiers whose hands could not hold a pen. The women who had carried cyanide pills 8 days earlier were now saving the lives of the men they had been taught to fear. But on January 28th, a convoy of 20 trucks arrived at Fort Davis carrying 2,000 German officers. And among them was a man who had been building a list. His name was Colonel Friedrich Steinberg. He had seen the German women in American medical scrubs from 50 yards away, and his face had done something that had nothing to do with pain from his infected leg wound, and everything to do with rage. One word: traitor. But Friedrich was just the beginning. Because 2 weeks after his confrontation in the medical tent, a different threat arrived. This one wore American insignia. Major Gerald Holt arrived at Fort Davis on February 11th from the Office of Prisoner Administration in Washington. He was 51 years old, career military bureaucrat, the kind of man who had never been near a front line, but had strong opinions about everything that happened on one. He carried a briefcase and a folder of regulations, and an expression that made clear he considered this assignment beneath him. Dixon met him in the administrative office at 0900. Holt sat down, opened the folder, and did not look up when he spoke. "You have German prisoners of war performing medical procedures on American soldiers," Holt said. "Are you aware that this violates Geneva Convention protocols regarding prisoner labor classification?" Dixon kept his voice level. "They volunteered. All 47 of them. I have the signed statements." "Volunteered." Holt said the word like it tasted wrong. "Colonel, these are enemy nationals, female enemy nationals. You have given them access to wounded American soldiers, to medical supplies, to the interior of a secured military facility. Do you understand what Washington will do if a single soldier dies and it comes out that a German prisoner had her hands inside him?" Dixon said Washington will probably also want to know what happened to the 3 soldiers who died of typhus last month, and whether that number would have been 30 if we had not treated the female prisoner population when we did. "I have those numbers too." Holt closed the folder. "Shut it down, Colonel. Effective immediately. The women return to standard prisoner status. No medical access, no contact with American personnel beyond routine guard interaction. I will need your compliance in writing by 1700. Dixon looked at the man across the desk from him. Then he said something that was not in any regulation and was absolutely true. "I have 12 nurses managing 60 new patients a day. I have a typhus outbreak that is not fully contained. I have 47 trained medical professionals who are currently the reason those numbers are not worse. If you shut this down today, major men will die in the next 72 hours who did not have to die. That is not a political position. That is arithmetic. Holt stood up. You have until 1700. He left. Dixon sat alone in the office for 4 minutes. Then he picked up the telephone. The call went to Colonel Arthur Fleming at the 5th Army Medical Command in San Antonio. Fleming was 58 years old, had served in the First World War, had seen a typhus outbreak consume an entire field hospital in France in 1918. He had lost 41 men to a disease that better sanitation would have prevented. He was not a man who forgot arithmetic. Dixon explained the situation in 9 sentences. Fleming listened without interrupting. Then Fleming said, "Send me the blood test results, the patient outcome data, and the names of the German women currently serving. I need them in 2 hours." Dixon sent them in 90 minutes. Fleming called Holt directly. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Holt left Fort Davis the following morning without his written compliance order and without speaking to Dixon again. The 47 women stayed. But Holt had done something before he left that nobody noticed until it was too late. He had filed a formal review request with the Prisoner Administration Office. The review would take 60 days. If it came back unfavorable, Dixon would have no authority to override it. The women's medical work would end, and it would end permanently, and there would be nothing Fleming or anyone else could do. 60 days. The clock was running. Dr. Harrison came to Dixon with the numbers on February 18th. He spread 3 pages of handwritten data on the desk between them. The first page showed the typhus infection rate among American guards before the female prisoner medical program began. The second page showed the rate after. The third page showed projected casualties if the program ended and the delousing maintenance lapsed. Before 14 confirmed typhus cases among guards in December 1944. After 2 cases in January 1945, both caught in early stage, both treated successfully. Projected if program ended between 40 and 70 new cases within 30 days, based on current lice population measurements in the male officer compound 2 miles away. The women are not just treating wounds, Harrison said. They are running the active surveillance that is keeping this camp from becoming an epidemic. If we lose them, we lose the surveillance. If we lose the surveillance, we lose the camp. Dixon looked at those numbers. He was not a bureaucrat. He was a man who had taken shrapnel at Guadalcanal and spent 3 months in a military hospital watching other men die from infections that competent nursing could have prevented. He understood exactly what the numbers meant. "How long do we have before the review comes back?" Dixon asked. 43 days, Harrison said. Then we need data that cannot be argued with. What Harrison proposed was simple and ruthless and effective. For the next 43 days, every patient outcome in the Fort Davis Medical Facility would be documented in detail that went far beyond standard military medical records. Every surgery performed by a German woman would be logged with the patient's name, rank, diagnosis, treatment, and outcome. Every case of typhus identified through prisoner population surveillance would be recorded alongside the names of the women who had flagged it. Every American soldier who left the medical tent recovered, rather than in a box, would have a paper trail, Harrison said. When the review comes back, I want it to read a file that is 400 pages long. I want them to understand that if they end this program, they are not ending a protocol. They are ending 400 pages of reasons men are still alive. The German women knew nothing about the administrative review. They knew only that the work continued, that the patients kept arriving, that the arithmetic of need and ability kept producing the same answer. They worked the same hours, held the same instruments, wrote the same letters home for soldiers who could not write their own. Margaret Hoffman performed her 31st surgery on February 20th. The patient was a 22-year-old from Alabama with a ruptured appendix that had been caught 12 hours too late for a clean operation. She worked for 4 hours. She did not think about the review or the paperwork or Major Holt's briefcase. She thought about the anatomy in front of her, the layers of tissue, the places where the infection had spread, and the places it had not yet reached. She thought about her oath, She thought about the arithmetic. She brought the soldier through. Mai. He was eating solid food by February 25th. Harrison logged it. Diagnosis treatment outcome. Name of attending physician. M. Hoffman, German National, POW, Barracks, 7. By March 1st, the file was 180 pages. By March 15th, it was 290 pages. Then, on March 18th, Friedrich Steinberg made his move. He had spent 6 weeks in the male officer compound, 2 miles from the medical tent, running what he considered a resistance operation, and what Dixon considered a disciplinary problem. He had already smuggled 1 letter to the women containing their names written in red ink. He had already threatened the interpreter, Helena Schmidt. On March 18th, he sent a message to a junior officer named Werner Boss with instructions to approach 3 of the German medical women separately, identify the one most likely to cooperate, and obtain the specific names and schedules of American medical personnel accessing the female compound. Friedrich was not planning an escape. He was planning something more sophisticated and more dangerous. He was collecting intelligence, names, schedules, supply routes, information that could be used if the right opportunity arose to do serious damage. Werner Boss approached Sophie Klein on the morning of March 18th during the brief daily exercise period when male and female prisoners occasionally occupied adjacent areas. He delivered Friedrich's message in 30 seconds, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie Klein listened to the entire message without expression. Then she walked directly to Sergeant Caldwell and repeated every word. Caldwell had Werner Boss in an isolation cell by noon. The report reached Dixon by 1400. Friedrich was informed through official channels that any further attempt to contact the female prisoner population would result in immediate transfer to a high-security facility in New Mexico, where his infected leg would be treated by whoever was available, and not by the German medical specialist who had been monitoring his case from a distance. And Friedrich received the message. He understood it completely. His leg was getting worse. The infection had not responded to the first round of antibiotics. Without proper ongoing treatment, the possibility of surgical intervention was rising. Without surgical intervention performed competently, the possibility of losing the leg was real. He was trapped by the same arithmetic that had trapped everyone else at Fort Davis. Need plus ability equals action. He needed medical care. The best medical care available in this compound was being provided by the women he had called traitors. He sent no more messages. He made no more lists. He sat in the male officer compound with his infected leg and his ideology and the slowly growing understanding that the war he had believed in was ending in a way that could not be recovered from. The administrative review came back on March 28th, 41 days, 19 days early. The review board had read 340 pages of patient outcome documentation. They had read Harrison's typhus surveillance reports. They had read Fleming's covering letter, which was 3 pages long, and contained the phrase, "These women have saved more American lives than most units currently deployed in Europe," in the second paragraph. The review came back approved. Full authorization for continued prisoner medical service at Fort Davis. No restrictions, no limitations. Signed by 3 officers, senior to Major Holt. Dixon read the approval in his office alone. He did not celebrate. He filed it in the administrative folder and went to check on the morning patient intake numbers. But that evening, he stopped by the medical tent on his way back to his quarters. Margaret was finishing notes on the day's cases. Harrison was updating the surveillance charts. Anna Weber was asleep in a chair in the corner, a pen still in her hand from the letter she had been writing for a soldier from Georgia. Dixon stood in the doorway for a moment. He did not speak. He was a man who expressed things through decisions rather than words, and the decision had already been made and filed and signed. Margaret looked up and saw his face. She had learned to read him in 2 months. The slight change around his eyes that meant something had been resolved. "We continue?" she asked. "You continue," Dixon said. He walked out into the Texas night. And in the male officer compound 2 miles away, Colonel Friedrich Steinberg sat on his cot in the dark and wrote a letter to his wife in Hamburg. The letter came back 3 weeks later, marked with a postal stamp he had never seen before. The city the stamp was from no longer existed in the form he remembered. Hamburg had been bombed to something that required new maps. He read the returned envelope for a long time. Then he wrote another letter. This one was not to his wife. It was addressed to a name he had not expected to write for any reason, except to threaten it. He wrote 3 sentences and stopped and did not send it. He folded the paper and put it under his mattress. He was not ready yet, but something had cracked in the certainty he had carried for 20 years. Something small and structural, the kind of crack that starts invisible and spreads slowly until the entire foundation shifts. In April, the war in Europe would begin its final 30 days. In May, it would end completely. And Friedrich would have to decide in the ruins of the ideology he had given his life to what the women he had called traitors actually were. And Margaret Hoffmann would receive a letter from her brother in Berlin that would tell her she was dead, that he had held her memorial service, that her name was no longer welcome in the family she had been born into. The enemy had accepted her. Her own country had buried her. The question of where she belonged was just beginning. 47 German women had walked into the American medical tent and proven that healing knew no flag. The administrative review had come back approved. The typhus surveillance was holding. Margaret Hoffmann had performed over 30 surgeries. Elizabeth Hoffmann was teaching techniques that American surgeons were writing down. The program that Major Holt had tried to shut down in February was now 340 pages of documented proof that the enemy could save your life. But something else was happening at Fort Davis that nobody had planned for and nobody could have predicted. The German officers in the male compound 2 miles away were watching, and they were talking, and word was moving through the prisoner network the way water moves through cracked stone. Slowly, inevitably, into every gap. By late March 1945, 40 German officer prisoners had formally requested medical evaluation by the Female Prisoner Medical Unit, not American doctors. The German women, men who had called those same women traitors 3 weeks earlier, were now asking through official channels for the traitors to treat them. Friedrich Steinberg was number 11 on the list. His infected leg had not improved. The first round of antibiotics had slowed the progression, but not stopped it. The American camp doctor had told him plainly on March 20th that without more aggressive intervention, surgical debridement was the next step. Friedrich had asked with the careful neutrality of a man swallowing significant pride whether it was possible to request a specific physician. The camp doctor had looked at him for a moment without expression. Then he had written a name on the referral form. M. Hoffmann, German national, Barracks 7. Margaret received the referral at 800 on March 22nd. She read the name on the form. She read it again. She set the form on the examination table and stood looking at it for approximately 30 seconds. Then she picked it up, initialed it, and added it to the morning patient queue. Elizabeth noticed. She said nothing. The look she gave Margaret across the tent said everything that needed saying. "You do not have to." Margaret's expression said what it always said. Blood is blood, pain is pain. I took an oath. Friedrich arrived at 1000, escorted by 2 guards walking with his carved wooden cane. His leg wound was wrapped in a field dressing that had not been changed in 4 days. The smell reached Margaret before he did. Yes. He stopped when he saw her at the examination table. She did not look up from the chart she was reading. She let him stand there for 5 seconds, which was not cruelty and not performance. It was simply time, and it belonged to her. Then she said in German without looking up, "Sit down and remove the dressing." He sat. He unwrapped the dressing himself slowly, with the careful movements of a man managing significant pain. The wound underneath was angry red, extending 3 inches in every direction from the original shrapnel entry point. Granulation tissue that should have been healthy was discolored. The edges were not closing. Margaret examined it with her hands and her eyes, and the knowledge that 3 years of Eastern Front surgical nursing had given Elizabeth, which Elizabeth had been transferring to Margaret in the operating tent for 2 months. She probed the wound edges with a sterile instrument. Friedrich made no sound, which told her his pain tolerance was high and his infection was worse than it looked.
क्या बात है?
She said, "The antibiotic is not reaching the core of the infection because there is dead tissue blocking it. I need to remove the dead tissue. It will take 40 minutes. You will need local anesthetic." Friedrich said nothing for a moment. Then, "Will it work?" "If we do it today," Margaret said, "probably yes. If we wait another week, I cannot promise you keep the leg." Another silence. Outside the tent, the Texas wind moved across the desert in long, flat gusts that rattled the canvas. Somewhere in the compound, a work detail was moving equipment. Normal sounds. The sounds of a prison camp operating in its established rhythms. Friedrich said quietly, "Do what is necessary." Margaret worked for 43 minutes. She removed necrotic tissue in careful layers, irrigated the wound with saline, applied a proper dressing with drainage. Friedrich sat without speaking through the entire procedure. His hands flat on his thighs, his face controlled. She watched his hands twice. They did not move. When she finished and was writing the aftercare instructions, Friedrich spoke again. His voice was different from every other time she had heard it. The military register was gone. What was left was something older and less certain. "Why?" he said. Not a challenge, a genuine question. After everything. Margaret finished writing before she answered. She capped her pen. She looked at him directly for the first time since he had walked in. "Because you needed treatment, and I am a doctor," she said. "That is the whole answer. There is no other answer." Friedrich looked at the bandaged leg. He looked at his hands. He said nothing more. The guards took him back to the mail compound at 10:50. He did not send any more letters. He did not compile any more lists. Over the following weeks, he received the follow-up wound checks Margaret had scheduled on his aftercare sheet. He arrived on time for each one. He sat down when instructed. He answered medical questions accurately. He said nothing beyond what was medically relevant. Except once. On April 12th, the day Franklin Roosevelt died, the entire camp received the news by early afternoon. It moved through the compound differently depending on who received it. American soldiers went quiet in the way people go quiet when something important has been removed from the world. German officers in the mail compound had a different reaction. A brief, visible energy that Friedrich watched from across the yard with something that was not participation. Margaret heard about the German officer's reaction through Helena that evening. She was sitting in the barracks after a long shift, too tired to sleep, yet the way exhaustion sometimes tips past itself into a kind of hollow wakefulness. Helena said, "Some of them celebrated. Friedrich did not." Margaret absorbed this. She did not know yet what it meant. She filed it alongside everything else she was learning about Friedrich, about the slow grinding collapse of the ideology that had held him in its shape for 20 years. About what happens to a man when the structure he built his life around fails, not through defeat from outside, but through the simpler and more devastating mechanism of being wrong. April 30th. Hitler was dead. May 7th. Germany surrendered. The news reached Fort Davis at noon on May 8th. Colonel Dixon gathered every prisoner in the main assembly area and read the announcement while Helena translated. Margaret stood in the assembly with Elizabeth on her left and Anna on her right. The three of them shoulder to shoulder in American medical scrubs over German uniforms in the Texas heat, listening to the words that ended the war that had made them enemies of the country, that had tried to kill them with typhus and neglect and cyanide pills pressed into their palms. She had expected to feel something clear. Relief. Grief. The specific weight of an ending. What she felt instead was more complicated, the way things always are when the event you have been building toward finally arrives, and turns out to be both exactly what you expected and nothing like it. Elizabeth said very quietly, It is over." Anna said nothing. She was looking at the ground, and her shoulders were doing the small, controlled movements of someone crying without making a sound. She was 20 years old. She had been 19 when they brought her to Fort Davis. The war she had been born into had ended while she was holding a wounded American soldier's hand in a medical tent in West Texas, writing a letter home for a boy from Georgia who missed his mother. The letters from Germany arrived in June. Helena's husband: "You lived. You helped the enemy. Do not return." Anna's mother: "Better dead than dishonored." Margaret's brother Hinrich: "We have told the neighbors you died heroically. I held a memorial service. It is better this way. Your name brings shame to the family." 34 of the 47 women received versions of the same letter. 34 women who had spent 6 months saving lives, who had been deloused and fed chocolate and treated as human beings by the enemy that propaganda had made into monsters, who had repaid that humanity with 400 pages of documented medical service, received letters from their own country informing them that survival was the same as betrayal. Elizabeth received no letter. Her parents had died in the Hamburg bombing. Her sister had died of starvation. Her brother was missing on the Eastern Front. There was no one left to reject her, which was its own kind of annihilation, the absence of even the cold comfort of being condemned by someone who was still alive. Margaret sat on her cot in Barracks 7, with Hinrich's letter in her hands, and felt the specific quality of grief that comes not from losing something, but from understanding that what you thought you had was never quite real. The brother she had believed in the family she had expected to return to the country that was supposed to be home. These had been assumptions she had carried through 6 months of surgery and typhus and chocolate bars, and Friedrich Steinberg's threats, and the assumptions had been wrong. The enemy had washed her uniform. Her brother had held her funeral. Lieutenant James Warren appeared in Colonel Dixon's office on June 30th with a file and a proposal. Warren was the logistics officer who had been watching the pattern of rejection letters arrive in the women's barracks for 2 weeks. He was not a sentimental man. He was a man who processed paperwork for a living and understood systems, and saw clearly when a system was producing a result that did not match its stated purpose. "These women saved American lives," Warren said. "British hospitals need nurses. America has a displaced person sponsorship program. If we find sponsors, we can get immigration visas." Dixon read the file. He read it a second time. Then he called a meeting. The 47 women gathered in the mess hall on the afternoon of June 30th. Dixon stood at the front of the room. He gave them 2 options. Option A: return to Germany. Face whatever was waiting. Rebuild in a country that was occupied and bombed and hostile to women who had cooperated with Allied forces. Option B: immigrate. Britain. America, Allied countries. Hospitals that needed them. New lives in places that would accept them. Then he added something that was not in any official briefing. Something that came from the same part of him that had returned Margaret's salute on January 19th without hesitation. "America does not forget who saved American lives," Dixon said. "We take care of our own. And after 6 months working side by side, you are ours now." Elizabeth Hoffman signed first. She had no family left in Germany. Nothing to return to but rubble and the memory of people who no longer existed. Britain was offering a position at London Royal Hospital. She signed her name on the immigration form with the same efficiency she brought to everything clean and certain and final. Anna needed a sponsor. A Methodist family in Yorkshire had responded to Warren's inquiry. Thomas and Margaret Wilson. They had lost their son William at Normandy at 19 years old, the same age Anna was now. They had written that William would have wanted them to help. That mercy was what he had died defending. That they could not bring William home, but they could give a home to someone else's child. Margaret signed papers for Boston, Massachusetts General Hospital. Infectious disease. Her typhus experience made her valuable in ways that her own country had never recognized and never would. Friedrich Steinberg stood at the fence on July 15th and watched the buses load. He watched through the chain link as 47 women climbed aboard with whatever they had, which was not much, which had never been much, which had become enough. His hands gripped the wire. His face was no longer the rigid mask of ideology it had been in January. 6 months had done to Friedrich what they had done to everyone at Fort Davis. Changed the shape of what he believed about the world and the people in it. His leg had healed. Margaret had done that. His certainty had not healed. He had done that himself, slowly, through the particular mechanism of watching people he had called traitors choose humanity over hatred every single day for 6 months, until the word traitor no longer meant what he had trained it to mean. Margaret saw him through the bus window as they drove toward the gate. She saw his face pressed against the fence. She saw something in his expression that she would not be able to name for another 20 years. Not until she was sitting beside his bed in a Munich hospital room, holding his hand while he died of pancreatic cancer, and asking her to forgive him. She did not forgive him that day on the bus. She was not ready. Forgiveness requires time and distance, and the full shape of a story, and on July 15, 1945, the story was not finished. Mom. But she looked at him. She let herself look at him, this man who had threatened her and listed her name and promised consequences that never arrived. This man whose leg she had saved and whose ideology she had outlasted. And she understood for the first time that he had lost everything too. That the war had broken him in its own way, hollowed out the certainty he had organized his entire life around, left him standing at a fence, watching the women he had called traitors drive away toward futures that existed because they had chosen correctly and he had not. Everyone at Fort Davis had been broken by something. The breaking was not the end of the story. The buses drove through the gate. The desert stretched flat and enormous in every direction, the same landscape that had been their prison and their transformation. The place where they had learned that enemies were just people, that blood was blood, that pain spoke the same language in every country, and that sometimes the 5 words that stop your heart are not the words you expected. The story of what these women built in the 20 years that followed in London and Yorkshire and Boston and Geneva. The lives they saved, and the doctors they trained, and the children they raised, and the single hospital room in Munich in November 1965, where the final chapter was written. That story was not over. It was just beginning to become what it actually was. Wool from a frozen barracks in West Texas. 47 German women had crossed the compound and chosen healing over hatred. They had saved hundreds of American lives, survived typhus and rejection, and Friedrich Steinberg's threats, and boarded buses on July 15, 1945, heading toward countries that had accepted them after the country that made them had not. The war was over. The program that Major Holt had tried to shut down in February had outlasted the entire European theater. But the story of what happened to these women afterward, what they built and who they became, and what a single deathbed conversation in Munich in 1965 finally completed, is the part that almost no history book contains. And it begins with a question that none of them could answer in 1945, when the enemy accepts you and your own country buries you. Which one is home? Elizabeth Hoffman arrived in London in August 1945 and went directly to work. The city was still scarred from 5 years of bombing. The hospitals were understaffed in ways that made Fort Davis look well-resourced by comparison. Elizabeth walked into her first shift at London Royal Hospital and proved her competence before noon. Within 1 month she was teaching. Within a year, she was writing the textbook she wished had existed when she was learning surgery in field hospitals on the Eastern Front, working by lamplight, with instruments that had been sterilized in whatever was available, making decisions in 30 seconds that medical school had given her 4 years to study. She wrote the textbook in English, her third language. She dedicated it to the wounded men of Fort Davis. American and German both, who had trusted her hands when they had every reason not to. The British medical establishment did not know what to make of her at first. A German woman, a prisoner of war, a person whose country had just spent 6 years trying to destroy the city she was now working to rebuild. The skepticism was quiet, but present, the kind that expresses itself through small administrative obstacles and conversations that stop when you enter the room. Elizabeth ignored it with the same efficiency she brought to surgery. She had survived Friedrich Steinberg. She had survived typhus in a barracks with rotting floor planks. She had survived the rejection letter from a Germany that no longer claimed her. British medical skepticism was not, by comparison, a serious obstacle. By 1950, she was department head. By 1960, surgeons she had trained were training other surgeons in techniques she had developed in the worst conditions imaginable and refined in a Texas prisoner of war camp. In 1970, the Queen honored her with a Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire for contributions to British medicine. The German woman called traitor had become Dame Elizabeth Hoffman. She attended the ceremony in London, wearing the Red Cross insignia she had earned in the German military, and kept through everything that followed. Nobody asked her to remove it. She did not offer to. Anna Weber arrived in Yorkshire in September 1945 and found the Wilson family waiting at the train station, an older couple holding a photograph of their son William, who had died at Normandy at 19. Margaret Wilson hugged Anna before saying a single word, held her with the particular fierceness of a woman who has lost one young person and is determined not to lose another. She said only, "You must be exhausted. Let us get you home." Anna enrolled in teacher training college in 1946. She had spent her war holding instruments and writing letters and comforting strangers. Teaching turned out to be the same skill applied differently. She married a local teacher in 1952. She had 3 children who grew up speaking English with Yorkshire accents and German with their mother, who grew up knowing that the categories of enemy and friend were not fixed points, but choices that people made every day, who grew up understanding that their mother had once been 19 years old in a frozen barracks holding a cyanide pill and had chosen instead to hold a wounded soldier's hand. Anna became headmistress of the primary school in 1963. She never returned to Germany. She never stopped speaking German. She kept both things, the language and the distance, and found that they did not contradict each other. Her mother in Munich died in 1958 without retracting the letter that said better dead than dishonored. Anna received notification of the death through official channels. She did not attend the funeral. She taught school that day the same as every other day, and her students noticed nothing different about her because she had learned long ago that grief and function were not opposites. Margaret Hoffman arrived in Boston in October 1945 and reported to Massachusetts General Hospital the following morning. She had a 6-month gap in her employment record that she explained with 2 sentences in her interview. The chief of infectious disease listened, looked at her work documentation from Fort Davis, which Harrison had ensured she left with, and hired her the same afternoon. Her first published paper appeared in the American Journal of Public Health in 1946. Title: Epidemic Typhus Prevention in Prisoner Populations. Lessons from the Fort Davis Intervention. It was the first paper by a German author in an American medical journal since before the war. The editors received 3 letters of complaint. They published the paper anyway because the science was sound, and science did not care about the complaints. Margaret became a consultant to the United States Public Health Service in 1949. She helped design epidemic response protocols that influenced how America approached disease containment for the next 3 decades. The woman who had carried a cyanide pill for 8 days in a Texas barracks became one of the leading architects of American preventable disease policy. The irony was not lost on her. She had been saved from typhus by the enemy. She spent the next 20 years ensuring that fewer people enemy or otherwise ever faced the same situation. She never remarried. Her first husband had gone missing at Stalingrad in February 1943. She kept his wedding ring in a small wooden box in her dresser and took it out sometimes late at night. Not from grief exactly, more from the habit of remembering who she had been before all of this. A girl who had believed the propaganda, who had carried the pill, who had touched a clean uniform on January 16, 1945, and felt the entire structure of her world begin to shift. Helena Schmidt worked for the World Health Organization from its founding in 1948. She was one of the few people on staff who spoke German, French, English, and functional Russian, who understood medical terminology in all 4 languages, who had experience with epidemic disease response in field conditions, and who knew from personal experience what it meant to be the person dying of the disease rather than the person treating it. She became one of WHO's most effective translators and field coordinators working in post-war Europe and eventually in developing countries where typhus and cholera and preventable death remained the ordinary condition of millions of people. Her husband had ended their 20-year marriage in 3 sentences. Helena worked for 40 years without returning to the city where she had lived that marriage. In 1985, a few years before her death, she gave an interview to a German historian who was documenting the female prisoner experience in American camps. She described arriving at Fort Davis, the terror of the delousing night, the chocolate bars, the letters from Germany. The historian asked her if she regretted any of it. Helena said, "I regret that it took a cyanide pill and a bar of chocolate to teach me that the enemy was a person. I do not regret what I did with the lesson once I learned it." In October 1965, Margaret received an invitation from Munich General Hospital requesting her expertise for a new trauma surgery program. She accepted because healing did not stop, because of borders, because knowledge belonged to whoever needed it, because the Germany that had rejected her and the Germany that needed her surgical techniques were 20 years later the same country asking different questions. She arrived in Munich wearing her American Red Cross insignia. On her 3rd day, she walked past a cafe and saw Daniel Murphy. Private Murphy, no longer private, no longer young. 44 years old in civilian clothes with gray in his hair, sitting at a table in the October afternoon light. He saw her at the same moment. 20 years dissolved. They sat in that cafe for 3 hours and drank coffee and shared a bar of British chocolate that Murphy had brought without knowing why, the same way he had always brought chocolate when something important was happening, because his sister Mary had liked chocolate and she had died at 7 years old, and some gestures become permanent. "Nay, we broke the cycle," Murphy said. "We proved healing is stronger than hatred." Margaret thought about Elizabeth's textbooks, and Anna's children, and Helena's fieldwork, and the 400 pages of patient documentation that had outlasted Major Holt's briefcase. "Yes," she said, "we broke it." 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from the Munich Cancer Treatment Center. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, terminal. A name on the return address she had not expected to read in any context except old fear. Colonel Friedrich Steinberg was asking to see her. She could have refused. She owed him nothing. He had threatened her, listed her name in red ink, called her a traitor. In front of her patients, promised consequences that never arrived. She had saved his leg in March 1945 because her oath required it, and her character permitted nothing less. She did not owe him her presence at his death. She went because healing included forgiveness, and forgiveness was not absolution of the person who wronged you. It was the release of the weight you carried on their behalf. It was in the end medicine for yourself as much as for them. The private room was small. Friedrich looked like the architecture of a man rather than the man himself. The bones still in their arrangement, but the substance gone reduced by cancer, the way the war had reduced everything, without preference, without ideology, without the small courtesies that distinguish one person from another. His eyes opened when she entered. He said, "You came. I did not think you would come." She checked his chart first because she was a doctor, and he was a patient, and that order of operations was not negotiable. Then she sat in the chair beside his bed, not close, not distant, simply present, because a dying man had asked, and she had chosen mercy. "I was wrong," Friedrich said. 3 words that had taken him 20 years to reach. "You were right. Healing came first. I could not see it then." He told her about Hamburg, about clearing rubble after the surrender, the labor details where former officers worked alongside former prisoners, the orphaned children in the streets, the buildings that had been homes and were now geometry. He told her about reading the letters from the women he had called traitors. Not to the women themselves, he had not had the right to contact them, but in the historical records that began emerging in the 1950s, the published papers and the documented outcomes and the 47 trajectories that had moved through Fort Davis and continued outward into the world. Messe, Elizabeth training British surgeons who trained German surgeons. Helena coordinating health responses that saved German lives. Margaret teaching techniques in Munich that were healing German patients right now this week in this city. You were all serving Germany better than I ever did, Friedrich said, and I called you traitors.
Team này.
The morphine pump clicked. His breathing was shallow and irregular. Outside the window, Munich was going about its ordinary October business, the city that had been bombed and rebuilt, the country that had been destroyed and reconstituted. The same geography, with a different government, and the slow, ongoing work of understanding what had happened and why, and whether understanding was the same as repair. Forgive me, Friedrich said. Not colonel to subordinate, not German to German, just human to human, dying man to healer. Please. Margaret looked at the man who had haunted her nightmares for 20 years and saw him clearly. Not a monster, not an ideologue, just a man who had believed lies and given his life to a cause that had taken everything from him and left him in a hospital bed, asking an enemy to be merciful because mercy was the only thing left that had any value. She took his skeletal hand. I forgive you, she said. Friedrich died on November 22, 1965. Margaret was holding his hand. His last words were, "Tell them. Tell the women I was wrong." She kept that promise. She wrote to Elizabeth and Anna and Helena within the week. She described the hospital room and the conversation and the last words. She did not ask for their response, did not require them to forgive or to feel anything specific. She simply told them because he had asked her to, and she had made a promise. Elizabeth wrote back one sentence, "I believe him." Anna wrote 3 sentences about her children, and enclosed a photograph of the Yorkshire school, where she was headmistress, 60 students arranged on stone steps in the autumn light. Helena wrote from Geneva, where she was preparing for a field deployment to West Africa. She wrote, "We broke the cycle at Fort Davis. He finally broke it in himself. That is also a kind of healing." The Fort Davis Museum opened in May 1975, 30 years after the end of the war. 15 of the original 47 women attended. Elizabeth flew from London. Anna came from Yorkshire with her husband and 3 grown children. Helena came from Geneva. Margaret came from Boston. Private Morrison attended. He was 49, gray-haired, carrying the scar on his abdomen from Margaret's first surgery as permanent evidence that choices have consequences that extend outward through time. He brought his wife 3 children and 7 grandchildren. He pointed to Margaret and said, "That woman saved my life, and because she saved me, all of you exist." His youngest grandchild was 7 years old, the same age as Mary Murphy, when she died from typhoid in rural Ohio in 1932. Murphy was there too. 54 years old. He brought chocolate. He always brought chocolate. The mathematics of one night's kindness. 200 chocolate bars purchased with a private's wages in January 1945 had rippled forward through 30 years into medical textbooks and international health protocols and Yorkshire schoolchildren and 7 grandchildren who existed because a German woman had chosen her oath over her fear. The louse that carried typhus bacteria too small to see with the naked eye. The kindness that broke 200 hearts. The clean uniform folded with mismatched stitching. The handwritten note that said 3 words, "You will survive." Not a promise about the war. A promise about something larger and longer than any war. A promise that the category of enemy was not permanent, that the human being on the other side of the wire was still a human being, that blood was blood and pain was pain, and that the stubborn persistence of mercy was stronger than the systematic machinery of hatred. From a frozen barracks in West Texas, 47 women had saved 400 American lives and carried their skills across an ocean and trained the doctors who trained other doctors for the next 50 years, and raised children who knew that enemies could become family if people chose correctly. They had proven that the oath to heal was not a professional credential. It was a description of what human beings are capable of when they decide that the person in front of them matters more than the flag above them. But Friedrich Steinberg had learned that truth 20 years too late and asked forgiveness for it with his last breath. The women he had threatened had given him that forgiveness not because he deserved it, but because they had learned something in Barracks 7 that he had not learned until he was dying. Cruelty confirms what you already believe. Kindness destroys the lie, the Countdown. And sometimes, the enemy you are most afraid of is standing outside in 28-degree cold, checking pressure gauges in a gas mask, spending his month's wages on chocolate bars, writing by flashlight. The 3 words that will change everything you thought you knew about the world. You will survive.